Well, good evening. It's great to see everybody here. I'm Brad Wetzler, and I'm the host of Sunday Live, the Writing for Peace, literary reading and discussion. And tonight we have a wonderful opportunity here to talk and hear from David Barton. I've known David a long time. We met in Santa Fe when I was living there, and he's I'll read a quick bio about him, and then we'll get him reading. But it's really going to be a special evening. So David Gilbreath Barton is an award-winning journalist and associate professor of humanities at Northern New Mexico College. From 1996 to 2001, he was the founding editor of Salt Journal, a finalist in the Utne Readers Award for Best Small Magazine in the Nation. He lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico with his wife. He's also a Jungian psychotherapist and an avid hiker, and just a polymath of a man. So, welcome here, David. Good to see you tonight.
Yeah, really good to see you, Brad, and really good to catch up with you. And I'm
great.
Honored to be here with this group Writing for Peace.
Well, good. Well, tonight I think it's going to be a special night too because of the subject matter. I think we find ourselves living in absurd times, and I know that the man you've written a biography about, Vaclav Havel, spent a lot of time, contemplating the absurd, writing about the absurd, and also government and democracy and all these issues. So I'm going to turn it over to you and have you set up your reading. Let us know what you're going to read first, and go ahead and go.
Sure. I thought, Brad, tonight I'd start with just a small reading from the introduction of the book, just to give people a sense of Vaclav Havel, who was first a poet, then a playwright, world-renowned playwright, one of the key figures in the theater of the absurd, later a band writer, a political dissident, an inmate, a political philosopher, and finally in 1989, he got out of jail in March and was elected president of his country in December. And I started working on Havel's biography back around 2011. It was a long haul for me, a labor of love, partly because he'd been a political prisoner, a dissident. His letters were scattered all over Canada, the United States, a few of his letters still in the Czech Republic, but it was really hard to come across all of his writings and to get them translated, which I did myself and with the help of my wife. And, with that said, I think I'll just jump right into a reading that I'm hoping will give us a good sense of Havel. So this is from the introduction, part one of the book. By nightfall, the crowds gathered. In the central squares of the city, the mourners lit votive candles whose small flames seemed like fragile witnesses under the darkened sky. Václav Havel, the conscience of the Republic, had died that morning, December 8th, 2011, 2 months after his 75th birthday. Many of the mourners stood at the foot of the statue of St. Wenceslaus, the good king of ancient Bohemia, the Rex Justus, who was remembered by all as a medieval philosopher king. There in front of St. Wenceslaus, the crowd laid down wreaths and candles and placards painted with large red hearts. Many wept. In the dark years, Havel would come to the statue of St. Wenceslaus many a time. As a dissident, he had laid a wreath here and ended many a demonstration, usually paying homage to one of the martyrs of communism. He had been here at the time of magic in 1989, when 500,000 people came to Wenceslaus Square to demand an end to communism, and to hear Havel call for a free Czechoslovakia, for democratic elections, and for a return to Europe. The crowd spoke The crowd of 500,000 demonstrators roared when Havel spoke. "Havel to the castle," they chanted, which meant Havel for president. And sure enough, a few weeks later, the thugs and dictators were chased from their positions of power, and Havel, dissident, ex-con, playwright, became a most unusual president. He was sometimes misunderstood and not always popular, but by the time of his death, everyone understood he'd already passed into legend. Havel was full of enigmas. To one faction, he appeared childlike and innocent, even angelic. To another, shrewd, worldly, calculating. At times, he appeared dry and pedantic, hopelessly rational. And yet, even when reciting the long list of dry facts, it became a hallmark of his personal communication. His bent was always towards the unseen and unsaid, towards some dear principle or humanistic idea that he was willing to defend at all cost. He was, in short, an idealist, perhaps even a romantic, but he was an idealist embarrassed by his own idealism, as if this side of himself were best kept under wraps, like a dark mole one keeps hidden under a buttoned shirt. References to light and hearts were everywhere the week of Havel's death. Madeleine Albright, the former American Secretary of State, told the crowd in Prague that Havel had been one of the true heroes of the 20th century, a man who injected light into the deepest darkness. Nor was this simply a metaphor used by diplomats. In the funeral procession, as thousands followed, a horse-drawn carriage that bore his corpse to Prague Castle, a simple midwife from Kladno, tears welling in her eyes, cried out that a great light had fallen from the sky. Those who had known Havel or who had followed his private heroics or public turmoil through the strange and transformative decades of communism could not help but wonder how Havel himself would have felt about the lavish state funeral and the requiem from Antonin Dvorak. In life, Havel was uncomfortable with praise, deeply so, and he had long preferred the smoky bars and bouts of all-night drinking to official events. His humor was sardonic, dark. He often preferred to see the world from its underside, or through the broken mirror of what he called the absurd. As president, he was known for giving confessionals, for speaking about his metaphysical sense of guilt, his sense that others would have been better in his place, or as he put it in a speech he gave in Israel, that, quote, "The higher I am, the stronger my suspicion that there had been some mistake." Many believed the funeral would have embarrassed him, or that he would have felt out of place or ambivalent about becoming the embodiment of official culture. As a child, he had longed for recognition, longed to be esteemed among the great, but the fantasy was at odds with the suspicion of his own absurdity, the suspicion of his shortcomings and failures, the inner sense that he was somehow inferior and ridiculous. As for the music, some suspected he would have preferred rock and roll to Dvorak, something along the lines of the Velvet Underground or the Rolling Stones. Havel loved the Velvet Underground. As far as Havel was concerned, Lou Reed sang like a prophet, his lyrics reveling in the nihilism of modern life. Reed's dark music had become something of an anthem for those who struggled against communism. When Havel coined the term Velvet Revolution to describe the political crisis of 1989, it was partly in tribute to Lou Reed's band. After the revolution, he asked Reed to join him while he was visiting the American White House, something of an embarrassment for President Bill Clinton, whose sex scandal was uncomfortably close to the illicit sex at the heart of much of Reed's music. Later, Havel insisted on making Reed a cultural ambassador. After giving Reed a personal tour of Prague, he presented him with a book of lyrics from the Velvet Underground that had circulated among the dissidents. Quote, "If the police caught you with that, you went straight to jail," Havel told Reed, as if that explained how passionately dissidents clung to the music. And I'll just read another page or so.
Right.
I saw Havel only once. On a late summer's day towards the end of his life, I found myself standing in the backyard of his country house at a spot where his garden disappears into a few scattered plum trees owned by his neighbor, an irascible man named André Krob. Havel and Krob were hosting their annual garden party, a tradition they began in the 1970s to stage music and plays that had been banned. Suffering from ill health, Havel walked about the party with great difficulty. Here and there he stopped to visit old friends, sharing chit-chat and snorts of Slivovice, or homemade plum brandy that he lugged about him in a heavy jug. Havel had lived long enough to achieve this recognition he craved as a child. But at the garden party, he was painfully reticent. When he spoke, he seemed to mumble, looking down at his shoes with an occasional wry smile, as if he was uncomfortable with being at the center of attention, even while simultaneously enjoying it. Any attempt to recount the life of Havel faces the same problem as attempting to balance a drop of mercury in the palm of a hand. As a subject, Havel refuses to remain still. Not only was he a man of many talents, poet, playwright, essayist, amateur philosopher, dissident politician, but he remained in constant movement, leaping continuously between the contradictions of his personality. He possessed a profound need for order, but pioneered a new movement in Czech theater that turned order upside down. He was painfully courteous, a courteous gentleman who despised disagreements, yet most of his life he found himself in conflict with the state. He inspired the nation through the power of language, but he spoke in a mumbling lisp, often doggedly plowing through hard facts. At the heart of Havel's contradiction was this oddity. He was a world-renowned playwright who hated to write. He often wrote with the help of pills and all-night bouts of wild energy, and he spent months, sometimes years, avoiding his plays as if they were infected by a dangerous virus. Writing was a way of ordering the world, of using his highly rational mind to impose meaning on the aching chaos around him. The senselessness, the brutality, the random absurdity of existence. And yet the medium he was drawn to, the only kind of theater he found he could appreciate, was the odd and relatively obscure branch of drama known as the theater of the absurd. A theater that fought to reveal the random, the senselessness of existence. He was a man of epic ambitions, a man with a deep need to put his stamp on the world, to impose on it some order of his own creation. And yet he was also suspicious of his ambition, suspicious of authority and control, suspicious not just of the 20th century, but the entire direction of the modern world, suspicious of our understandings of power, of the rational scientific attitude that had conquered the national world and alienated us from it, and of the industrialized mind that had mechanized the world and turned us into machines. When Havel wrote either his essays or his plays, it was almost always to express these themes. His plays were partly an act of exorcism, and the act of writing tormented him. His friends suspected that he became a dissident and later a president as a way to avoid finishing his plays. So that's a bit of the introduction to the book to give you a sense of Havel, who The actor Robert Redford once said after meeting him was a man in contradiction with himself.
Mhm.
And I think that's maybe enough, Brad, enough of sort of an introduction for
Yeah.
us to, have a bit of a conversation.
Yeah, I guess I'm fascinated to learn. I mean, I remember you starting this project 9 years ago, but can you talk a little bit about how and why Havel kind of took hold of you, and maybe talk about what it was like to live in his head and maybe him in your head for 9 years?
Yeah, well, my daughter was born in Prague. My daughter was born in Prague. My wife is Czech. I lived in what was then Czechoslovakia for 3 years, and I was taken by Havel, just taken by him, by not only by his plays, but by his, I think, profound critique, not only of communism, but of the modern world. And, a critique in which he largely saw communism as a sort of final result of modernity, of the Enlightenment, of the conquest of the rational mind over everything, including nature and human nature. And there was a quote that often haunted me when writing about Havel, and it came from a speech he wrote in 1984, a rather symbolic year, and it was for a university in France that had given him an honorary doctorate, and he couldn't attend, so the playwright Tom Stoppard, the English playwright, read his speech, and in that talk given by Stoppard for Havel, he talked about life on the east side of the Iron Curtain under communism as being a convex mirror of the modern world and of the West. In other words, it showed in exaggeration sort of the illness of modern society as a whole. I was really taken with that, and 25 years later, after I first read that quote in the 1990s, I see him as more prescient than ever.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about your process of writing this book? And I guess knowing that you're a Jungian psychotherapist, and I know that you have dream journaled for a long time. Can you talk about sort of how Havel, existed for you, and how you brought him to life, and just talk more about the process and please.
Yeah, so I'm sort of recognizing this is a group that has a lot of literary people, a lot of writers, a lot of creative artists. Is that right?
Correct.
Brad?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, one of my understandings of the writing process is it's something for many people, I think, something like prayer and meditation. It's a way of getting into a way of not only understanding a sort of finding our authentic voice, but also getting out of daily consciousness, right? Trying to find the voice that will say things that feel wiser than what we already know. So, for me, I don't know that I have any one particular process. I kind of always laugh at that term,
Did he show up in your dreams, though, David? Can I interrupt you? Did he show up in your dreams?
More in my body, I think, living with somebody that closely, reading, translating, something like 600 letters, reading and rereading his plays, trying to get into his head. I felt, if anything, what that did to me is make me more constipated, sort of more in contradiction to myself,
Mm.
The couple of weeks I spent, writing about his prison years, I was had a horrible bout of sympathetic hemorrhoids, much like the ones that Havel had in prison. So it was a bit like being undergoing his tortures in order to understand him better.
Very interesting. Well, what do you have to read for us next, Dave?
Yeah, there were a couple of different directions we might go in. But one I thought I would do that, maybe this makes most sense for where we've been going, since it's a little bit about Havel as a writer, a little bit about his writing process. And to set up this chapter, this will just be a shorter reading. Havel had been one of the literary intellectuals who spoke out during the Prague Spring, calling for democratic elections. On August 20th, 1968, the Soviet Union responded, along with the 5 Warsaw Pact countries, with invading the country to stop the democratic process. And typical of Havel, he was with a close friend, the actor Jan Triska, and both of their wives at an all-night drinking party in the town of Liberec. And they were still listening to rock and roll at daylight, which comes about 4 to 4:30, when they heard the tanks rumbling through the streets. And Havel and Jan Triska immediately barricaded themselves in the local radio station and broadcast for 3 days. At that time, or after that time, Havel felt he was in personal danger. His life might be in danger. He was certainly in danger of going to prison. And his response was to try to make a personal peace, to retire to his cabin near the giant mountains and just live this kind of separate life, just to become a writer in solitude. And that only worked for him for a small amount of time, because he decided that he just couldn't endure living in the society without speaking up. So this chapter is about his retreat to his beloved Hradeček. The farmhouse at Hradeček was drafty and cold, but the Havels remained there like hermits through the first snows of what would be the coldest winter in more than 100 years. They finally retreated to the well-insulated family apartment in Prague in time for the Christmas holidays. They stayed in the city for less than 2 months before returning to the farmhouse. By the time Havel wrote Vera Blackwell on February 22nd, 1970, one of their cats had wandered off into the frozen woods, never to return. 3 weeks later, the snowdrifts were 2 meters deep. Olga loved living in the country. She also loved being the master of her own house. Although Havel's father had eventually warmed up to her, relationship with Havel's mother was still cold and distant. As for Havel, he felt that the isolation at Hradeček calmed his nerves. He now felt lost when visiting Prague. For one thing, he had no job, no place to be, but it was more than that. The grand city with its medieval streets and Renaissance palaces seemed oppressive. Havel felt the political situation had made his literary friends neurotic. He no longer looked forward to the social life in Prague. to the gatherings and the little parties and late nights at the Slavia Cafe. Instead, he worried constantly about who he should and shouldn't visit, and whether being seen with a friend might get them into trouble with authorities. Even inviting someone over to the apartment was fraught with unpleasant complications. Havel felt it put others in an impossible situation, since declining might make it appear that they were afraid of the state. With his highly developed sense of courtesy, Havel worried it was rude to even ask. By 1970, the basic outlines of the future could be seen. The state had closed the border, travel had been restricted, and the shelves at the grocery store began to empty. Once the borders closed, the only toothpaste Havel could find was made in Czechoslovakia. He found this infuriating since, as he wrote to his translator in London, Czech brands were idiotic. They didn't foam when he brushed his teeth. Now that few of his friends were able to travel abroad, he had to write to foreigners begging them to mail him toothpaste from, quote, a capitalistic province. As for the arts, technically everyone was free to work. No book had been banned or removed from the libraries, although that would come soon enough. Writers were free to write what they wished to say, but in the brave new world, only those graced by the regime would find a publisher or a theater who would dare to produce their play. The entire cultural atmosphere was like a house without any light. In order to find anything, one had to grope about in the darkness or simply take a wild guess in order to find a wall or doorknob or to navigate down a corridor. There were no longer any laws or rules, except what the Communist Party chose to enforce. The chaotic situation made Havel's life seem strangely doubled. Was Havel destitute or fabulously wealthy? Was he shackled or free? It all depended on how he looked at the situation, and how he looked at the situation changed every week, if not every day. For the moment, Havel was wealthy, at least by Czech standards. A single $1,200 royalty advance from the Lincoln Center, received in 1970 for the increased difficulty of concentration, was equivalent to a full year's salary in Czechoslovakia. At the same time, there was almost no chance he would find a meaningful job should his foreign royalties be cut off. As Havel put it, the only job he would be allowed to work would be a job that he wouldn't want. And while Havel enjoyed far more personal freedom than most people, this was simply because he had no position and no job for the state to take away. The state could throw him in prison, however. In his upcoming court case, there was little chance he would have a fair trial. And let's see, let me read just a little bit more because it gets to his writing process and style. The plays rarely came to him easily. Havel wrote slowly and with great difficulty, often giving in to despair or recriminating himself for not writing more quickly or having more ideas or more talent. Havel tended to piece together his plays as if they were a strange geometric puzzle. He often became obsessed with repeating elements from scene to scene, putting words or slogans of one character in the mouth of another, or replaying entire conversations as if the characters on the stage were broken records. He used such devices to create an aura of absurdity, evoking a world that, as he put it, felt frightening, schematic, almost machine-like. He thought of this as an attempt to unveil the fantasies underneath the communist ideology, but he was working out his own obsessions as well. Writing The Conspirators, that long, snowy winter of 1969-1970, Havel felt back on all the writing tricks that had served him so well in the past. He experimented with writing quickly, slowly, either spontaneously or by exact schedule, by hand, by typewriter, by day and by night. At the center of his writing process was what he called a thinking scheme, quote unquote, basically a web of connections that made up the heart of the play. The thinking scheme might be abstract or philosophical, but in order to be effective, it had to be deeply personal. It had to reach deep into his life, evoking the questions and problems that he kept picking at like an old scab. And sometime, I'll skip a few paragraphs to get to the end here. Sometime in February, Havel chain-smoked his way through a rewrite and turned the play over to Olga, who often served as his first audience. He read her play out loud, a trick he'd learned in the theater. Hearing the words, he would become aware of where the play seemed to contain tension, humor, intelligence, and where it was boring, dry, without teeth, or simply confusing. Olga wouldn't have to say anything, and as if picking something out of the air, he would suddenly understand how to solve a problem that had bedeviled him for weeks. Last paragraph. A few days later, he wrote to Vera Blackwell. Well, no, I'll end it there. That's a good place to stop.
Great. Thank you, David. You know, as I was reading the book, my mind kept going to Camus, I think, and in a particular quote, in the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. And that makes me happy, for it says that no matter how hard the world pushes against me, within me, there's something stronger, something better pushing right back. Am I wrong, or was there a sense of optimism to Havel, despite all the things he'd gone through?
Yeah, that's a really interesting paradox, Brad. And he wrote about this a lot in his letters. Why obsess with the negative, with the wrong, with these thoughts of absurdity or meaninglessness? And he had a sort of interesting answer, which was what he thought the theater of the absurd was all about. And it's a little bit hard to get to, but he thought in confronting the absence of meaning, he thought in confronting the nihilism of modern society, that because that's something we can't endure, it creates a sort of a vacuum or a sort of space where meaning comes back into the picture. So he's a deeply spiritual man, a deeply spiritual writer, who flirted with Christianity while he was in prison and went to prison confessions. But he felt that the only honest way in his circumstances to meaning was to first experience the complete absence of meaning, at least in the society he lived in. And he thought in all modern society, including, our disconnection from nature, right? Very primary. Our disconnection from each other, our disconnection from our own conscience.
I giggled and was fascinated to see that he signed his name above a heart, often a red heart. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that came over him in the last period of his life. Much of the 1970s were spent sort of in isolation till which he broke out of. Excuse me, I've got my allergies from New Mexico have been kicking in today. Just a second. So he had spent the 1970s first in isolation and then forming a political movement called Charter 77, and then a human rights organization to monitor political prisoners. He spent the late 70s and 80s in prison, came out of prison with a very deep depression. And in the mid 1980s, having been this person who was tortured by the writing process and tortured over whether he should commit to standing up to the regime or retreating to his private farmhouse, he had a series of absolute creative and spiritual breakthroughs, mostly thanks to his lover, I think, Jitka Wonianska, who was taught yoga and was a psychologist, among other things. He wrote his next two plays. The Conspirators took him something like 5 to 6 years to finish, and he wrote his next two plays in 4 to 5 days each. And after that experience, in the beginning of the Velvet Revolution, where communism started falling, he took to signing his letters with the big V that he wrote, Vaclav Havel, and he'd take usually a green or a red marker and put this big heart right underneath his name. And so any letters you find from about 1988 onward have this big sentimental heart, which really became a symbol for him, as if he had broken through all of his intellectualization, his intellect, his internalized totalitarian regime, as if that just broke through and gave way, and what was left for him was this heart response to the world. It was
he was tortured by his own intellect, in a way.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes. Tortured by it, and of course it was a great tool for him as well.
Philip Richards, who's reading next week, has an interesting question. I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. That is there a sense that Havel might have felt trapped in obviously the stage was big in Czechoslovakia at the time. At the same time, it was did he long to be in France or to be in the US where things were bigger? And
absolutely. I think one of the real themes of my book and the way I see Havel is there were 3 periods in his life where he had a chance to leave. The first was in 1968 when, freaking out about the Soviet invasion, he got the Ford Foundation to send him a fellowship to come to the United States for a year. He could have easily stayed. And he got himself in a whole series of problems, including getting arrested in order to stick in the Czech Republic. The second 2 times were while he was in prison. During one of those, the secret police came to visit him in prison and gave him an offer to be escorted out of the jail that day if he would agree to immigrate. And they gave him something like half an hour to make a decision, and he got permission to ask 3 of his fellow prisoners whether he should take it. And he decided to remain in prison rather than to immigrate. So those are long anecdotes, but what I'm getting at is this tension in him between the desire to flee, to live the easy and good life in the West, which was a very real desire for him, and the desire to grow down and stay where he was. And ultimately for him, it was a matter of conscience. He felt and wrote about the problem in 1968 as he had been one of the intellectuals who had sort of forced the situation that led to the collapse of the Prague Spring. he had an easy out to leave as a world famous playwright. But what would that do to the culture if all the playwrights and artists and intellectuals and poets left and fled?
Mm.
So there was this real sense of, do I stay or do I leave? Can I stay at Radicek and just write and have my own separate peace with the regime? Or do I have to stand up and speak? Is there a sense of obligation and sacrifice and listening to my conscience that is required of me by from out of my own like sense of being?
I'm seeing an opportunity for an awkward transition here. That should I stay or should I go? So he was a rock and roll fan. That was a Clash line there.
Yeah.
Can you talk about his obsession with Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, and how rock and roll fed his?
Yeah, it was big
spirit?
for him. It was big for him. Part of that was the 60s and the magic of Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. He had a chance to visit New York in April of 1968. He was there for 2 to 3 weeks to see the world premiere of one of his plays. I don't remember which one it was. And he marched in the street with the hippies. He sort of loved and fit, the hippie movement. And yet he was not of them, right? He was a world-class intellectual, somewhat stiff, somewhat, way too rational. But then later in the 1970s, he joined forces with the Dlouhivasi, what they called in the Czech Republic, the long hairs. And the Czech hippie movement became, sort of a cornerstone of at least one portion of the Charter 77 movement. I don't know what drew him to rock and roll, but it was certainly like that sense of American freedom, right? And he was attracted to the idea of America as certainly like a symbol for him of freedom and liberty and the ability to do what you want.
You think his own restraint and his personality, maybe that was an outlet for him to fantasize about? Yeah.
And so that's the constant struggle with him, his personal sense of restraint and the way he's always drawn to people who have no restraint whatsoever. Yeah, what he couldn't have, right?
Yeah. What would he have to say about the protest movements in America, and what would he have advice? How would he speak about that, or to us today?
He once said he hated revolutions; they were too messy. And of course, he led one in Czechoslovakia. He had a lot of fantasies about his American experience in '68. That was an important moment for him. And as a dissident, he spent a lot of his adult life in petitions, protest marches, such as they were in Czechoslovakia. So I think he'd have a real fondness for what's going on. On the one hand, a real fondness. On the other hand, for Havel, sacrifice, the idea of sacrifice and conscience is absolutely key. So, I think he had a real skepticism about part of the American character. And, our sense that, we can make, today, post Havel, that, we can make a Twitter post or say something on Facebook, and we've fulfilled our obligations as citizens. He was very clear that citizenship required very active participation, especially by those who were educated, especially by artists, especially by people who had a sort of a sense and a vision for society. There's a sort of, that's a Central European tradition that artists have a role in the political situation. We just don't have that, I think.
What would he say about Facebook and social media today? I mean, what do you think he would?
Facebook's this queer form, isn't it? I mean, I love to get on Facebook because I can check in on you and a couple of other people I see here that I know, like Ann Yeomans or Terry Mueller. And but it's also, primarily this narcissistic vehicle, isn't it?
Mm,
I mean, social media is all about me. What do I have to say? Who will like me? There's very little we involved. Now that's my take, but I think that we all enjoy that narcissism to some extent.
mm,
But where is the sacrifice? Where is the sense of engaging our own moral consciousness? And I remember about 20 years ago, many of us started talking about what was happening to civic society in this country. There was those really interesting studies about the loss of bowling leagues, for instance, the loss of citizenship participation in city council meetings, neighborhood associations, churches, synagogues. So now we've got the extreme of that, right? We sit at home and engage on Facebook or Twitter.
yeah.
And,
Ironically, though, David, I just read today that Facebook is coming up with emergency measures to take for during post or pre and post election. And I think one thing we're seeing is just how much this platform has affected the social fabric of our nation and the world. Yeah, just interesting how.
right. No newspaper, for example, speaking as a former journalist to a former journalist, what newspaper or magazine could publish sort of the same number of sort of anonymous, non-fact, falsehoods and not be sued for libel? It's really problematic. And I don't think we've, at some point we're going to have to deal with it as a culture.
Yeah. Let me shift a little bit, David. So living in these absurd times, can you talk about how this project, which was an epic project, 9 years, and also given that your subject was so obsessed with meaning, what meaning, what of life did you get from this? Not just a small m meaning, but a capital M meaning.
Aside from being happy that I'm done, the joy of being finished.
Uh-huh.
I think it's hard for me to step back far enough and answer that. He's been an important part of my life for a long period of time. I'm moved by sort of his commitment to the world around him, his willingness to engage, to grow down, not to flee. I don't, can each of us live up to that? Probably hardly so, given his standard that he set.
Mm.
But I see it in this country, actually, oddly enough. I mean, I'm a lifelong liberal. I see that kind of commitment more actually in the Republican Party right now, like the Lincoln Project, the Republicans who are standing up and saying, I'm going to put country above party. People who have been willing to give up their careers, any future in the Republican Party, to say, the stuff that's going on out of our White House just, cannot continue.
Mm-hmm.
That takes real moral courage, I think.
Right. What else do you have left to read for us tonight?
Well, I've got a real downer I could end with. And, Havel did spend most of his life with physical bouts of illness. And let's see if I can find it.
While you're looking for it, I actually have one more question I thought of. I know how hard you tried to get another meeting with him or get a sit down with him.
Yeah.
and I know it didn't happen, that he got ill and he stonewalled you first for quite a while, and then he got ill, and then he died.
Yeah.
What was missing that you hoped to get? And or do you think it was somehow poetically right that it didn't happen?
That's interesting because my finger is right on the paragraph where I talk about that.
Okay.
And since it's personal, I'll go ahead and read it. So this is really short, like 5 minutes or so. I heard about Havel's death by way of breaking news while I was sitting at my desk in my house in Santa Fe. On my computer screen was a 4-page letter I planned to mail during the holidays explaining once again why I thought we should sit down for an interview. As I had written in my letter, there was still a great deal of his life I didn't understand. I wanted, for instance, to know more about the writer's block that haunted him for much of his life. And I wanted to know why he thought it vanished after his depression in the early 1980s, while he was in the midst of the love affair with Jitka Wodnanska. I wanted to know just what Jitka had given him, and I wanted to know how a man who often spent years writing a play turned into the president, who dashed off scores of the most interesting speeches in his era while being overwhelmed by the duties of the state. I wanted to know how a famously cerebral man, an analytical intellectual known for his dry discourse, had taken to signing his name above a heart, often one he drew in red ink. What did it signify? And Havel's life didn't conclude with the Velvet Revolution. By some accounts, it had just begun. The long years of resistance gave way to something entirely new. As president, he was, as he himself said, quote, catapulted overnight into a world of fairy tales. The international fame, the press coverage, and the trappings of being head of state were all part of what he called a diabolical trap set for me by destiny. For Havel, being president felt absurd, and he worried about his need for power, about how much he enjoyed it. In a speech given in Jerusalem, he imagined that he would wake up in a prison cell and realize the entire presidency had all been a fabulous dream. From another point of view, however, the presidency is a mere footnote to the larger story of his life. The real Havel, the heroic part of his life, came earlier. In many ways, the presidency was a matter of tidying up what he had been working on for more than 25 years, putting things in order, attempting to institute the ideas of the Velvet Revolution into the offices of the government. In this regard, he made some important accomplishments as president, but his life as president was, by nature, more routine. And then I'll switch finally to one quick scene. In the 1990s, Havel was often portrayed in the foreign media as a reluctant president, a playwright who sacrificed himself for his country, a free-spirited postmodern bohemian who was forced to buckle down and run a country. Later, Havel was sometimes demythologized and seen as a man who had used his reticence as a ruse, secretly positioning himself to be in power while simultaneously appearing to avoid it. The truth is, he was both individuals. While Havel believed in the virtue of politics, he was also suspicious of the ease with which he accepted the role of presidency, and suspicious of how long he stayed in power. He enjoyed the presidency, and he also resented its seductive hold. With his sense of absurdity, he had always understood that those in power are often the individuals with the least amount of freedom, forced, as he once said of Gorbachev, to live a life of endless meetings, negotiation sessions, and speeches. At times, he found his life unbearable. In the early years of his presidency, Havel spoke about these ironies incessantly. Perhaps the most honest moment came in the spring after the Velvet Revolution on a weekend trip to the presidential retreat, the country estate at Laney that had originally been created by Thomas Masaryk. Havel had managed in his hectic schedule to arrange time to visit with Jitka Wodnanska, his previous lover. Olga, perhaps feeling guilty for separating the two back in 1988, had graciously disappeared back to Prague so that the two old lovers could be alone for a few hours. Havel explained to Jitka what he was learning about the office of the presidency and showed her his new diplomatic passport, which listed his profession as president, a source of deep amusement, last paragraph. Later, while they were on the sofa, Havel put his head in her lap and told her this was the first moment's relaxation he had had since becoming president. He then cried softly, and she gently stroked his hair. Havel told her, "What have you done to me? I feel responsible for the whole world. This is worse than prison. There I was responsible for myself only. Here, not only am I watched, but I cannot make a single mistake." And so for me, that's the ultimate sort of act of him growing down into a sort of obligation, a sort of continuation of his life's calling that was not easy to reconcile with.
Thank you, David. We've got just a couple more minutes. I'm happy to unmute folks, and if there's anyone has a question they wanted to ask David, just have a few minutes. Vicky? Nope. You got to unmute yourself, Vicky.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, okay, we can hear you now.
My question, I really enjoyed your presentation. It's very interesting and a very complex human being and writer. But I'm wondering, I've never read him, and I'm wondering if you had one play that you would recommend.
Oh, yes. What a great question. Thank you, Vicky. It might be more interesting rather than the play. It might be more interesting to read his series of interviews that he conducted as a dissident, called, the wonderful title being "Disturbing the Peace." I love that title, by the way. Disturbing the peace being what Havel thinks we all need to do as good citizens, right?
I was thinking, like, in terms of him as an artist, wanting to read, the actual artistic work.
Yeah, yeah.
Poetry
sure.
as well.
Sure. So his book-length collection of letters to Olga, if you want to know his philosophy, and then I'll give a play maybe. So letters to Olga, he was able to write a letter once a week, and he sort of consciously began thinking of those letters as a book-length essay on not only the theater, his sort of vision of life and the role of us as human beings in the world together. So that's Letters to Olga. And then maybe a play. I'm trying to think of what like one of his a really fun play might be something like, I'm thinking one of those two last plays he wrote where he just sort of broke out and wrote them in these almost trance states. So Temptation, which is his version of the Faust story, which he had been haunted by for many years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you,
Before
Brad.
before we say goodnight, do you have a next project? I mean, I know you have a busy life and you have clients, and but do you have a next writing project?
Well, I have a notebook full of projects, but I'm still sort of in the stew and working on what that might be. I know
Right.
you know and appreciate what that's like.
I do. I think many of us here do. Well, thank you, David. And Phil, I saw you on mute, but we're going to have you next week. So I'm looking forward to having Phil next week. So next week is Phil Richards. He's a literary journalist, a memoirist, a scholar. His memoir is about growing up Black in Cleveland, and he's written a lot about academic life and around the world, actually, especially at Colgate, where he's a professor emeritus. And I think I'm really looking forward to Phil next week. So, but that's our hour, people. And so thank you for being here, and really a special thanks to David Barton. And what a great reading this was. And so thank you so much for being here, David.
Yeah, thank you all. And I love y'all's little group, and y'all keep up the good work.
Great. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks for the very
Thank you
entertaining.
very much. It was very good.
Good night,
Yes.
everybody.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. And hello to some of the people I know here, Ann and Terry and James.
It was
Good
awesome.
seeing you all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.